Journey to Greatness Character Lessons from the Past is an interactive lesson designed to help you discover how the challenges you might face today, such as fear, prejudice, poverty, not fitting in, or anger, can be overcome by learning how heroes from our past overcame similar challenges when they were young. Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King Jr., and many other American heroes faced enormous challenges to end slavery and work toward freedom and equality for all. When they were young, they didn't know their actions would someday change the world. By never giving up and facing each new challenge in their life journey as it came, they became heroes. As you go through this lesson, you'll discover part of the journey to greatness experienced by Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Martin Luther King Jr. Before you do, let's begin with you and your journey. Take some time to think about some of the challenges we face in life. Which of these challenges have you faced? Fear or uncertainty? Racism or prejudice?
In 1825, when I was all of 3 years old, I started to see and go through firsthand the pain and agony of slavery. Even years later, I couldn't get the terrible things that I saw and heard out of my mind, like women being beaten, families, including my own, being separated, and the great sadness that all this caused. My 2 sisters were taken away from us forever. These sounds and those pictures in my mind, they have never left me. Also around this time, I suffered an injury that would touch me for the rest of my life. I was at a store and I got between an overseer and a slave who was in a disagreement. The overseer was chasing after the slave and had called him out in the store. I tried to protect the slave by blocking the path of the overseer, but just then he threw a heavy lead weight at the slave who was running away, and it hit me in the head instead of the slave. Hurt me pretty bad. Despite being hurt bad, I was sent back to work. And when I couldn't work, I was sent back to my owner. I laid in bed for months getting better. All this time my owner tried to sell me, but he couldn't find no buyers.
Harriet Tubman can't believe she was able to escape. She was so scared running away. At every minute she just knew she'd be caught and punished. But she made it. But what now? So many others continued to suffer as she suffered. So many families were being separated and destroyed. What would you have done in this situation?
Later, in 1835, when I was 12 years old, the masters had pretty much figured out that I wasn't cut out for household chores. Instead, they had me working outside, doing work that was usually done by men, such as working in a flax patch. I had to walk through the field with plants that was twice as tall as me and stiff stalks that would scratch my legs as I pulled each plant up by the roots. When I wasn't working in the flax fields, I was shucking corn, weeding the wheat fields, or shoveling manure. Other times, I would lift heavy barrels of flour into carts. I did like this work more than the jobs inside the house.
Harriet Tubman was a slave. She worked hard every day and had no freedom to work for herself, only others. Sometimes she wondered whether she should even work hard at all. Why should she?
Miss Susan didn't have to pay much for me, being only 7 years old. I was so small that when I went to work for Miss Susan, that I had to sit on the floor to be able to safely hold the baby. Besides caring for the baby, I had to do the cleaning and other household chores. Since I was so young, I hadn't yet learned how to do those kinds of chores. My mistress, Miss Susan, didn't teach me how to clean, but she sure did get mad when I didn't do a good job. Luckily, Miss Susan's sister took pity on me and taught me how to clean and do other chores. I was so tired. I'd spend the day doing household chores, then spend the night rocking the baby so it wouldn't cry and wake up the master and the mistress of the house. Now, if that baby did cry, Miss Susan would whip me with the whip.
Even though my master punished people frequently and harshly, I was not often whipped by him. Something that caused me more suffering than the whippings was hunger. I had very little food, and it was boiled, coarse cornmeal called mush. They would put the mush into a big trough and put it on the ground just like they were feeding pigs. We had to eat the mush with our hands. Even worse than the hunger, though, was the bitter cold. I had no shoes, no socks, no coat, and no pants. The only thing I wore was a coarse linen shirt that hung down to my knees. I didn't have a bed, and so on the coldest nights I would take a corn sack and crawl into it, trying to shiver myself to sleep on the cold, damp dirt floor. I don't know how I survived the cold. There wasn't much for me to do because I was so young. I would drive the cows up in the evening, keep the birds out of the garden, keep the front yard clean, and run errands for my old master's daughter.
Because of the horrible whippings and beatings Frederick Douglass witnessed, he decided that all white people must be the same and that he shouldn't trust them. But when he got to Baltimore, he saw a white lady smiling at him. She was Sophia Auld, and she was to be his new mistress. From his old master, Douglass knew how masters treat their slaves. But this lady seemed different. What should Douglass do? How could he trust a white person after what he had seen? Do you have any words of advice you could offer Frederick Douglass about what he should do? At the age of 23 years old, Frederick Douglass was asked to speak at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket. Should he do it? It would be frightening to speak at a convention. He's just one person. Would people really care what he had to say?
I knew that, at that time, I was just too young to even think of running away. In the meantime, I decided I would learn to write. I didn't have paper and pencils, so I had to be creative in finding materials with which to write. I would use chalk and write on fences, walls, and pavement. I had a Webster spelling book, and I practiced and practiced the italic writing until I could do it without looking at the book. It took a long time, but I finally did learn to write.
Could Frederick Douglass really run away and be free? Frederick Douglass is 12 and he really does want to be free. Should he try right now? Do you have any words of advice you could offer him?
I was born in Talbot County, Maryland, in February of 1818. I never knew my mother, seeing her only 4 or 5 times, and only at night. They told me that when she came to see me, it was always during the night after a hard day's work, and she would walk the whole way. My mother would lie down with me and get me to sleep, but she was always gone before I woke up. She died when I was 7. I never knew my father, although there were rumors that he was my master. By 1834, I was working for William Freeland. Mr. Freeland, my master, only owned 2 slaves besides me. Their names were Henry and John. They were very smart, and while I was there, I encouraged them to learn to read. They were eager to learn, so I agreed to teach them. On Sunday afternoons, I would give them reading lessons at the home of a free colored man, and slaves from neighboring farms would often come and learn too.
Even though my mother and mama had tried to explain why things were the way they were, I wanted more information. When I was 12 years old, I started reading books that taught me more about history of slavery in Africa and here in America. I read books about the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves. I read about people like Harriet Tubman, a former slave woman who helped many slaves escape to freedom on the Underground Railroad.
Martin Luther King Jr. learned a lot about slavery and the oppression of blacks, but he still didn't understand. It was so frustrating, and he wanted to learn more about it. The problem was that he had read all of the books he had and his father's books as well. He wanted to get more books, but his dad said he wouldn't give him any money. Do you have any words of advice you could offer him in this situation?
One time, we went to a downtown shoe store. We sat down toward the front of the store, and the clerk came up and politely asked us to move to seats near the rear of the store. When we said we were comfortable where we were, she said we'd need to move to the back. So my father took me and we walked out of the store. I had never seen my dad so angry. Dad told me that day that no matter how long he had to live with things the way they were, he'd never accept it.
When Martin Luther King Jr. was about 8 years old, he was in one of the downtown stores of Atlanta, and a white woman suddenly slapped him and called him the N-word, saying that he had stepped on her foot. How would you have responded? Remember, this was the late 1930s in the segregated American South.
Another incident occurred when I was riding with him one day in the car. My dad accidentally drove past the stop sign. The policeman called him boy, and my father explained to him that he was a man, not a boy. The policeman was surprised at how my father corrected his wording so eloquently, and he quickly wrote the ticket and left.
At this time, Martin Luther King Jr. was only 17 years old. His father had asked him to try his hand at conducting a church service, just like a real minister would. This would be a great chance to see if he could really do what he thought he could. But what if it didn't go well?